Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are. I see, people from all over the country joining us. We also heard that people from DC is following us in YouTube right now. So this is very exciting. This is one of the good things about presenting online, that we have the opportunity to reach out to a broader audience. So we are very pleased to have today SHAUM and Rosalind SHIEH, who are going to be presenting their work that they have been doing in Marfa. So this is an initiative that emerged from the Historic Preservation Program here in the School of Architecture, in collaboration with the Center of American Architecture and Design, and of course the School of Architecture. To have them here, we're really happy to have them. Isabella Den is one of our historic preservation faculty members, was instrumental in getting us in touch and making sure that this will take place. I'm just briefly going to try to introduce well Troy and Rosalind. So I'm going to start with Rosalind, who is an architect and educator and a partner at SHAUM and SHIEH. There's an architectural collaboration that is operating between Houston, Texas, and New York City. She teaches at MIT, where she is the Marion Mahoney Emerging Practitioner Fellow. And her research interests include the relationship between urbanism and sociality, and she's currently working on a project about the place at the intersection of material culture, oral history, and post-colonial identity in Taiwan. She has taught in different universities such as Yale, Cooper Union, Syracuse, University of Michigan, and has received a number of awards and certificates from different programs across the entire country. Troy, on the other hand, is also a partner with Rosalind and the SHAUM and SHIEH practice. He's the director of the totalization at the Rice School of Architecture, where he is an associate professor. His design and research interests focus on new possibilities for form, representation, and politics in the post-megalopolitan city. Troy has an extensive experience building at a range of scales. Prior to founding SHAUM and SHIEH, he was a project architect at OMA, and has also worked at LTL and Studio Daniel Levitskin, both in New York, and Jim Jennings, architect in San Francisco. The firm that they both have, right, as I mentioned, is a collaboration between Houston and New York City that was established back in 2010 around overlapping interest in art, form, and the city, and have developed a dialogue through projects ranging from buildings and installations to speculative projects to unsolicited urban plans. The practice has a particular interest in the city at the scale of the building, both as a site of theoretical experimentation and as a reality that might be transformed through building. They work at a range of scales with completed projects in Detroit, New York, Houston, and Virginia. And the recent ongoing work includes master plan for the Judd Foundation and restoration of the Chamberlain building for the Chanati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, the headquarters for an arts institution in Houston, and proposals for residential tower on Park Avenue in New York City. Their firm was named a 2019 Emerging Voice winner by the Architectural League of New York, a finalist in the 2017 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program, and named one of the 2016 New Practices New York by the AIA. They have been exhibited in many places: Venice Biennale, Art Prize in Grand Rapids, a storefront for art and architecture, and the Center for Architecture in New York. So today they will be talking, as I mentioned, about the work they have been doing in Marfa, Texas, for the Donald Judd Foundation and the Chanati Foundation, where they have been working, I think, for nearly a decade on protecting and preserving their buildings. So without further ado, I will just pass the microphone or the screen to Troy and Rosalind. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate this opportunity, and well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Thank you for having us visit, whatever that means today. And we really appreciate the invitation from you and the department here at University of Texas, and also especially to Isabella for helping make the connection for us to be part of this Goldsmith talk series. It's especially very amazing for us to be speaking in the context of a preservation department, which you'll see in this talk makes up a significant part of our practice, actually, but which we're rarely in a position to share in our public talks. It's an ongoing work that we've been doing with many collaborators, and we're going to try to name and elaborate on all this, as many of those collaborations as possible through the talk. But I'm sure we'll miss some of them. And then you gave us such a great introduction that this is going to seem a little bit redundant. But some of what we wanted to explain is how a design firm like ours ended up in Marfa, Texas, working with the Judd Foundation and the Chanati Foundation on the preservation of Donald Judd's buildings there. Our firm, as you noted, is a design firm based in Houston and New York, and we've done a series of projects from art institutions to art installations to music venues and other kinds of things, which is what we usually spend more of our time talking about. This is a very particular part of our work that relates to the legacy of Donald Judd. And so I'm going to do a little bit of work to situate Donald Judd's artistic and architectural practice broadly, and then in Marfa for those in the audience that are perhaps new to his work. So Donald Judd is an artist whose practice spanned from the late 50s till his sudden passing in 1994. His work moved quickly in that time period from painting to three-dimensional work that challenged the conventions of disciplinarity that were prevalent at the time in the mid-century art practices. Specific objects is perhaps his best known critical work, of which there were many, because he maintained an active critical practice, critical writing practice. Specific objects advocated for non-illusionistic, non-referential approach to art practice that confronted new materials and forms that were emerging at the time. An interesting note, this is to some of the legacies that maybe Benjamin and Michelle would be aware of. Caitlin Murray from the Judd Foundation actually sent us from their archive a talk that Donald Judd gave here in 1992 at University of Texas about his architectural practice in the architecture school. And we mined that talk for some of his reflections on the architecture we're going to speak about today. It was a particularly informative talk because it came at what turned out to be late in his career, but also because he was speaking directly to an architectural audience in Texas. And so, so it was pretty interesting. And so you can see Donald Judd here pictured with some of his works in 1970. This is a series of untitled mill aluminum pieces. Marfa has a collection of 100 milled aluminum pieces installed at the Chanati Foundation in the artillery sheds, which you can visit when the coronavirus is not dominating our lives. So this is Marfa, Texas. Marfa, Texas is situated on the border of Mexico and Texas, just below New Mexico. in the region of the Chihuahuan Desert and the Chanati Mountains. This is an image of Marfa, Texas, that shows Marfa in the 1930s. You can see this is the Marfa Courthouse. It's actually been restored as part of the Texas Courthouse Restoration Project in Highland Avenue. You can see how quickly at that time Marfa fell off into what was cattle country. And the economy in that time was dominated by the cattle industry and the cavalry base that was at the edge of town. As the cavalry base was closed and the cattle industry needed less labor in order to get its cattle to market, the town became less and less populated. And Donald Judd arrived in 1973 after a search for places to live and work outside of New York City. And that search included drawing circles around major airports in the Southwest, including San Diego. And he looked, according to his stories, at Baja California, but was worried about issues around moving art across the border. And he had memories of traveling through Marfa as a young man. And Marfa is close enough to the El Paso airport that he came back to Marfa and started acquiring properties. Some of the buildings that we're going to look at today, you can see already in this photograph. This is the Glasscock building, which is become the architecture office building, which we're currently restoring. This is the print building that currently has the visitor services and the offices of the Judd Foundation in it. You can see this is the site that the Chamberlain building, which we'll speak about later, occupies now, which is a former warehouse. This shows a collection of buildings, and you can see that there's a number of buildings that the Judd Foundation owns. The foundation included, I should say, the Judd Foundation includes all that was Judd's personal holdings, and both in Marfa and including 101 Spring Street in New York, and the spaces that he lived and worked in while he was alive and practicing. In this map, you can see those that are in downtown Marfa in blue, the center of which is, in terms of your visits to Marfa and the kind of experience that's being maintained, is what you might know as the block, which is this space that Judd occupied, and he lived and worked in Marfa in town when he first moved. And he slowly acquired more spaces in town. The courthouse is this way to the right of the screen. The building that you see in pink is the Chamberlain building, which is owned by the Chanati Foundation. And the Chanati Foundation is the public foundation that was formed in Judd's lifetime that housed Judd's work, but also the work of other artists. Most of the Chanati Foundation is at the edge of town, which is off the map, at the old cavalry base, which was known as Fort D.A. Russell, and is now the site of the Chanati Foundation. And that's where, if you know Marfa and you know the large concrete works that are a kilometer long, that they live at the Chanati Foundation out there. Also, what you're not seeing is a number of ranch properties beyond the Chanati Mountains, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This is the block that I pointed to earlier, and this is an example of Judd's interventions in Marfa. And when Judd first moved to Marfa, he began living at the block, and he constructed several architectural operations at the block. These are adobe walls, the large adobe walls that surround the block. These are old aircraft hangars that he converted into spaces for art. This courtyard is actually a landscape installation by Judd that deals with tilted planes and perception. And you can see that the hangars are filled with a lot of Judd's early artwork and unique pieces of work that Judd wanted to be in conversation with and situated in the place that was best for the art, not so much necessarily the best for the public to view the art, but was best for the art to live and to be seen, and to connect the art to the buildings and to the landscape.
Okay, so Judd acquired more than 20 buildings as well as a significant amount of ranch land that Troy just mentioned, over 22 years. And we began working with the Judd Foundation in 2012, focusing on Marfa just after they finished the renovation on 101 Spring Street, which is the Donald Judd's building in Soho, New York, which the Judd Foundation worked with Architecture Research Office on. So for us, this period started as, or this relationship and this work started as a period of learning and listening and cataloging. And I think we see our work early on as a kind of reflecting back to the Judd Foundation what their needs were, working together with them to document and organize, extending and building notably upon the work started by firms like Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager, SGH, and scholars like Upe Flukiger with students at Texas Tech, who had done a good deal of initial work in drawing and inventorying the collection of Judd buildings. And this is what we call our building index, which shows each individual building drawn in elevation. In order to make order from the situation as we found it, we worked through a series of abstract diagrams. This is something that we often do in our work, is to develop ways of seeing that reflect back to us and those who we are working with, an understanding of the project that aids us and our collaborators in how to understand the larger issues and how to proceed. So here you see the collection of buildings, you see the relationship to the ground. What's coded here are wet and dry spaces and the needs around that. The identification of installed spaces, which were Donald Judd's living spaces that remain as he left them, versus supporting and operational spaces, and so on. And you can see here, go back for a second, Troy. Yeah, you can see here from the way that the buildings are named, the uses that were intended for each building, the print building, the art studio, the furniture studio, and so on. Donald Judd, you could say, had a kind of categorical understanding of use that he used to sort the buildings. They were kind of defined by single uses or inhabitations. And that was produced sometimes a kind of interesting tension with the historical character of the existing buildings. We also looked at how the collection of spaces were apportioned or used, breaking them down into categories, such as like the total set of projects, but then also the mixture of needs, what portion required restoration, what portion involved completing unrealized plans of Judd's, how much support space or spaces that dealt with collection and protection were needed, what growth might be needed that was not accommodated in the existing buildings. Next slide. And in working with the Judd Foundation, we also identified some goals that they had. One major one was and is to expand the access of Judd's living and working spaces, the installed spaces, which are still mostly private, in order to convert a large portion of these to be open to the public. And here you can see from the left to the right that grows quite significantly. And so within the work, this is the work that we've engaged with the Judd Foundation over the last 9 years. We wanted to talk a little bit in depth about a couple of examples. So you can go to the next slide, yeah. So this is kind of closer to street level. You see the courthouse and the architecture office there on the corner. So this project here, the architecture office, served as a initial pilot through which we worked together with the Judd Foundation through some ideas about how to understand Judd's particular approach to architecture and how it relates to restoration and preservation. So these are some of these old photos of the main street. The architecture office is a red brick building. It's also called the Glasscock building. And here you can see it on the right. And then its relationship to the courthouse beyond. So you can see here kind of the old balconies, the old canopy. This is what happens when one is controlling what is talking. It's okay. Yeah, so you can see like the kind of things that have changed on that building over the years. And go to the next one. Yeah, and then at some point, the building was painted white. And this is more or less what it looked like when Judd acquired the building in 1990. And after he bought it, go to the next slide, he stripped off the paint. And he turned that lower level where the storefront is that you see into the architecture office. And there's a barber shop to the left of that, which he kept. And then there was a guest apartment, turned the upstairs into a guest apartment. And here it is after Judd's changes. And I think we were kind of thinking about how to describe this, but here I think we might say that as alteration, the architecture office could be described as a kind of operation of revealing as restoration, kind of stripping away to reveal a different condition. And I think what's interesting to note is to refer back to the lecture that Judd gave at UT in 1992 that Troy mentioned, which was right around when he was working on the architecture office. He said something that gives some clues to his work in Marfa. He said, I think the first act of architecture would be to do nothing whatsoever and think about it all for a few days. And in the lecture, he goes on, he's countering this attitude to the architect's impulse to see breaking ground as the first act, or clearing, right? And so I think for him, rather, the first act would be to spend some time and to see what's there. And so perhaps in this, we can see in these words, Donald Judd is a kind of preservationist himself in his approach, which for us gives some clues as to his unique way of thinking about architecture and guides us a bit in learning from his restraint, working here and also personally for us in our other work as well. It prompts us to think about what we don't do as being perhaps as significant, if not more significant than what we do. And then the fact when you start a new project or you approach a new building or a site, you're not starting from nothing.
So he also, in that lecture, speaks, talks a lot about the land and the relationship of his artwork and the building towards land. And he describes one way we could think about concepts, the context and the site of a building as an archaeological situation, which extends how we might consider how these buildings are embedded in place. And we love this image also from the time period he began to occupy the building. It really shows that these buildings enmeshed in a kind of urban, West Texas urban context, and in a West Texas urban context that also operates as a kind of an urban island in an otherwise kind of broad and like challenging landscape that was worked for cattle and other resource extraction. So this is an image of the actual architectural office. This is a space that was used by Donald Judd to design architectural projects that he was working on in Europe and really all over the world. And you can see the architectural drawings that he was working on at the time, including things like prototypes. You can see in the back, this is a prototype for a steel pivot door, other hand-done architectural drawings, models, artifacts. This is an example in this particular project of an installed space, which is a space that's been documented and left with the collection of objects, artifacts, and other pieces of inspiration that that were in the space and used in the space at the time. And so this was what the building looked like when we first encountered it. The upstairs windows had all been removed because the wood had deteriorated and water had come into the building, which meant the John Chamberlain wall pieces that were in the visitor's apartment on the second floor had to be removed, as many of the furniture artifacts. On the ground level, a wood frame had to be added around this west window in order to keep water infiltration from leaking into the building. The barber was still working there, but besides the installed space and the barber, the building was more or less unoccupied. And you can see here, I wanted to point out with this image, the kind of the frame on this west window, and the reason it was deteriorated, and part of what we're trying to do is the building, as you saw, was originally protected by canopies. There were canopies on two sides of the building, and the light in West Texas is quite harsh. And so you can see the shades, the frame, and the lack of canopy is really creating a kind of, in this case, kind of barrier between the street and the work, and the ability to see the work, and also creating a conservation challenge for the work that's actually in the installed space itself. And you get a sense here of the amount of deterioration that existed in the brick. The brick is 3-wive stick, and the outside had many loose bricks and many bricks that were removed for fear of falling. And so one of the first things we had to do was start to work on the brick enclosure. This is just a sample of some of the drawings that we've been doing to communicate and work on the project. You can see a simple catalog of some of the things that we worked on the project. And the project was broken into multiple small pieces that we've been working on over the years with various subcontractors and collaborations. But all of the windows and doors had to be pulled out and repaired and replaced. We replaced the glass with low-E insulated glazing to protect the materials on the inside and for energy efficiency. New storefront windows had to be reconstructed out of wood. We're in the process of installing a new canopy to protect the exposures in the installed space. We redid the interiors of the apartments upstairs so we could reinstall the Chamberlain pieces and the works that were in the guest apartment on the upstairs in the second floor. And this still has a note about solar panels, which is something that we could get into in the Q&A or more deeply. But we really realized, because of the number of buildings that we're working on in Marfa, actually makes sense not so much on a building by building basis, but we're looking into how to think about small scale grids that could mobilize more than one building at a time to deliver renewable energy, because the Judd Foundation and our clients are really interested in figuring out how to move away from, or move to renewable energy. And then this is a kind of image of the kind of drawings we make. Representation for us is really critical in this project, and you'll see some examples of that, because we're always very sensitive to the idea that this is not a design project in our design practice, but something that we're trying to figure out how to expertly reflect the legacy of Judd's work in Marfa through the representation. And so we rely a lot heavily on these kind of line work drawings. So this is some details I just wanted to speak about, since we're talking directly to a preservation and conservation audience that might be curious about some of the detailing. One of the things that we worked through on the brick on the facade, which was quite tricky, and you can see it pretty strongly here in the image on the right, is that the brick had been sandblasted to take the paint off. And also in that sandblasting, there was a relief that came out in the mortar joints. And so there's really a sense, even before the wall started deteriorating, that each individual brick was kind of floating in a shadow field. And everyone was very used to seeing that building that way. Donald Judd had left the building in that condition, although that condition was exaggerated through the deterioration of the mortar. And so what you see here on the left is the more typical Marfa style of mortar joint and repointing. And we worked really closely with a group out of Winnipeg. And this is an example of one of the collaborations that I wanted to highlight, called Alpha Masonry, who sent one of their master masons down from Winnipeg, who is an expert in restoration, who worked locally with RC Concepts, who was our local contractor and masons, to develop a strategy to repoint the brick, but repoint it in a way where the joints would get raked, and then the brick itself would have to be cleaned so that when you stand back from the facade, you still get the shadow lines on the facade and that character of both the textured brick and the kind of shadow line of each individual brick as you stand away from the detail. Here's the teams working together. This is Tony Guerrero, who's the master mason from Canada, working to actually rebuild this whole corner of the facade, which is kind of an amazing thing to watch somebody that has that kind of skill pull that corner apart and put it back together. This is a detail of the actual interior of the architecture office. So Donald Judd, as you saw in the earlier image, actually stripped away the plaster on the back side of his architectural office space. And this is the kind of some of the inventive detailing that sometimes you're figuring out how to maintain and to preserve. And the way that he hung the drawings on the wall, and you can see in the image in a way that looks almost seamless, like you have no idea how these drawings are floating on the brick wall. This is just an example of the kind of small details. Was he actually squirted, I guess is the proper term, silicone into the joints of the interior brick wall, so that he could put very small push pins into that silicone to hang his drawings. And so one of the problems that we have with preservation there is the train, the Union Pacific Railroad that flies by multiple times a day, vibrates the building quite a lot. And so if there's any sort of loose material in the wall, it ends up on the artifacts and in the space. So this wall also is a wall that we worked in that session to repoint in a way that we could also, have the rake joints that allows us to, or the Judd Foundation to reinstall the silicone and reinstall the work. And so this is an image of that space, that work. And this is Juan Martinez from RC Concepts and Tony Guerrero and Satirius from Alpha Masonry kind of working on the wall together. And so, another example of this is looking at the window detailing. And so we drew through and worked with Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hagert's, our consultants and our waterproofing consultants on, window details that all very closely, almost exactly matched the existing conditions and the existing windows, in where we could, updating them to improve the waterproofing conditions. And we produced the details, but we wanted to work locally with local skill. So these window details, instead of being interpreted, by a national window fabricator, were actually worked on by John Antonitis, who's the carpenter you see on the right, and Randy Sanchez, who's a person who's been working at the Judd Foundation for decades and has countless amount of skills. You can't say enough about the amount of skills that Randy has, brings to the table in preserving these buildings. And so they actually work together in Marfa to build, I don't know the total count, but it's 23 windows just upstairs, to build these windows locally in Marfa and install them locally, following our details, but with some modifications that need to be made in order to get them fabricated, by a carpenter. And lastly, this is another detail that comes out of the window. So the installed space was something that we had looked at very closely with Image Permanent Institute from IPI, called IPI, from Rochester Institute of Technology in New York, and they specialize in the preservation of collection preservation and collection protection. And we developed a system when we began to study what the relative humidity and temperature conditions were in Marfa that could, because many of the buildings do not have air conditioning and heating in their current condition, could begin to use a fan-assisted passive system to mitigate the extremes of the environment on the hottest and coldest days of the year. And this, as Rosa mentioned, was a pilot project. And so we did a test case where we're installing in a kind of beam at the transom level of the windows in the installed space, a kind of vent that allows for a dust filter. And we're going to be able to use through an exhaust system to pull air on the hottest day of the year. We can do it in the middle of the night, and on the coldest days of the year, we can do it in the middle of the day, in a way that'll mitigate the extremes of temperature swings in that area and humidity swings in that area. And the data that we've done in the analysis with this team shows that this should work, but this would be the test case for that, and we can do the monitoring and see if it's a program that we can expand or tweak and expand for other buildings. And then in this phase, we've been doing a lot of work with Method Construction, who's a local Marfa builder, in this next phase to actually shore up the structure of the basement, which again has the whole building is vibrated by the terrain quite a lot, and so there's a lot of reinforcement in the basement through the whole structure that we've been trying to do in a sensitive way, but also finishing the work of adding the canopy and finishing out the work downstairs so the building could be occupied by the end of summer 2021.
Yeah, so we do consider what we're doing here in Marfa to be preservation and restoration, but we are design architects, and so we don't presume to have a stable definition of what those terms are. But we have come to understand to some degree that that's what we are doing here. And these words, preservation and restoration, I don't know, I guess like maybe we talk about them because we have a little bit of like discomfort or imposter syndrome when we use those terms. They've become kind of meaningful in a unique way for us because they've been formed around our understanding of Donald Judd's approach to architecture as a mixture of alteration, intervention, and in some cases also a kind of like revelation of something that is not simply historic or referring to the past. So next slide. In Marfa, these operations and tactics of preservation and restoration are complicated by its remoteness. This is a view of the desert just at the edge. And this definitely presents challenges, but also it's a quality, this remoteness is a quality that simply presents a different condition with different possibilities. And this kind of embeddedness in place opens up in a way because the place has a different relationship than say like an old traditional city site, which we learn about and study in schools of architecture. This has a different relationship to history, to time, and to entropy. So as we mentioned before, the scope of Donald Judd's work extends beyond Marfa and includes also 51 square miles of ranch land. Next slide. In this area beyond the Chanati Mountains to the southwest, there are 3 ranches in this kind of border zone region between Texas and Mexico and New Mexico in the Chihuahuan Desert. And if you drive 2.5 hours, and it's a bit of a rough drive, you'll get to Las Casas. So the next slide. So Las Casas is a collection of buildings and structures within this flat spot here on the Mexican-facing side of the Chanati Mountains. This is a landscape that extends to the southwest of Marfa towards Mexico, and this is also where Donald Judd often lived and worked in his later years. What was existing when Judd acquired it? Troy, can you point? There's the corral, right? The corral, the old barn to the right there, that became the art studio. The 2 buildings, Don's house and the kitchen building, right? And then the water tank. And then the lower corrals also are there. And then what Judd did was he added the bunkhouse, right? And then the structures around and next to the tank, those round structures. And then those street structures over by the corral, right? And so there's a kind of mixture of kind of adding, altering, and extending what was there. And the winds on this site come very strongly down the Rio Grande Valley from the right, and it hits this building on the right there, which is the one we want to talk about, which caused the ridge beam to break. And the ridge beam was just a simple 1x6. So this is the building to the right there. we were tasked with figuring out, oh, sorry. I think this is your part, Troy. You're muted.
Sorry, partners talking. So we were tasked with figuring out how to help with the restoration and repair of this remote building. It's incredibly hard to get to. Again, it's a rough 2.5 hour drive. There's not electricity at the site. So you have to work from a generator, or people have to stay there when they work there because you can't commute. And you can only transport things that you could pull behind a really intense West Texas pickup truck with a 16-foot trailer to get out there. And so what quickly became, apparent to us is, well, these are masonry stone walls. What looks like these masonry stone walls were actually a telephone pole barn structure, which is a common way in which some barn structures and auxiliary buildings were made out there. And you can see the barn structure actually had metal siding, and it was this way to some degree when Judd acquired the property, with metal siding and a stone cladding. And then Donald Judd, in order to build out the space to become his art studio, built a 2x4 wall on the inside, you can see on the left, to create the space that you see here with Nate Smith from SGH, the engineer, doing some drawings with us. But when we encountered it, it was shored up because the wind had broken the ridge beam, as Rosalind said, and we had to figure out how to develop a solution that it could be repaired and preserved in this remote location. And so, in repairing the roof, we were able to introduce a structural diaphragm of plywood with a layer of ice and water shield to protect the art studio from any leaks in the sometimes heavy rains that they get out there, but also introduce, in the research we did, we realized that the void space that exists to conceal the telephone poles also is a great insulator. And so we were able to add some more heat bridge insulation by adding another layer of void space, and then the galvanized steel roofing on top of that void space. So the heat that is quite intense in the summer on the steel doesn't actually translate into the interior. And you can see that space was vented in a ridge cap that you can see down here in this detail. We also had to design with SGH a steel beam and system that could be broken into pieces. It's a almost 40-foot long steel ridge. And it's supported on new columns that we added to the sides, but could be broken up into sections, put together into the beam, and then erected with basically manual labor, lifted into place on the site. And then that detailing had to be detailed so that when you see it from the exterior, the wood rafter tails and the wood detailing is conceals the steel on the inside. And so you can see here, this is a layout of the new structure. That's the roof wood structure. And you can see that only every other piece of structure actually is part of the exposed rafter tails that are part of the kind of iconic look of these types of structures in that part of West Texas. You can see the big cavity that's left around by the telephone poles, and the kind of framing of the skylights, which is another detail that we were able to reinsert in a way that was not visible from the ground or from above. Proper skylight curbs to small, but proper skylight curbs to prevent any leaking in the roof. And then this is what the art studio looked like when we were able to get the artwork and the artifacts reinstalled in the space. And so, in this harsh, dramatic context, it was the interior of the art studio that's completely closed to the outside. It's a space of refuge in a way. And it has this kind of incredible interiority, especially because of the double layer of walls and the stone and the insulation. And also, just note to understand Donald Judd's art practice at this point, if this is his art studio, is a practice that, this isn't a place for art making per se, in the sense of actually fabrication, but a lot of drawing and reflection. A lot of the work happens on legal pads and sketches on notepads, which we'll show you an example of in a minute. But and so within this remoteness, this kind of frontier zone of Las Casas, we seem to think Judd found a different archaeology of the land, and this project's a reflection. Small project's a reflection on that.
Okay, so the last project we want to talk about brings us back to Marfa, switching from the Judd Foundation, and we're looking now at the Chanati Foundation. So this Rollins company, this is what becomes the Chamberlain building, named for the collection of the sculptor John Chamberlain's work that Judd installed here and is on continuous public display. The Chamberlain building belongs to the Chanati Foundation. And as we mentioned earlier, there are two foundations, the Judd Foundation being Judd's personal foundation, and the Chanati, which was set up by Donald Judd and Dia, was originally established to exhibit and house the work of other artists. It was always meant to be open to the public. And so the history of the Chamberlain building, it's actually 3 buildings end to end connected. And what you're looking at here is the end that faces the east side on the main street of Marfa on Highland Avenue, the one that goes north and ends at the courthouse. And then this is the building that's on the other side, the other end of the Chamberlain building. It's on the west side or the back side. And these buildings were built as warehouses along the railroad, which runs along the south side. And you'll see this better in the next slide. Oh, well, maybe not this one, but the next one. Okay. This is the front again. Go back to the front. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. And just to point out the old windows and the entrance stair, and you can see the configuration of openings here when Donald Judd acquired it, which he filled in, and you'll see that in the next one. So you can see them infilled here to either like kind of the white areas, those same windows. And you can, if you look through this window, this new window, you can make out the Glasscock building, which is, as we said, another name for the architecture office across Highland Avenue. And this window here, these are the four square pivot windows that Judd installs throughout. Some of them pivot, like the whole window pivots, and in some cases, just one of the lights in the corner pivots. So go to the next slide. Yeah, and here you can see the view, kind of contemporary view to now. You can see the railroad there on the left side, which is the south side. And between the buildings and the railroad, there was a railroad siding, which is a kind of low-speed track spur that comes off the main line for deliveries because it's a warehouse, which Donald Judd planted over with sotol plants.
So some of what we see here is the complexity of this project is that we're really seeing a mix of 3 buildings that have been seen together. And here's one of the seams that we're seeing movement on. There's 2 steel buildings, essentially light steel frame buildings in masonry, and one that's masonry and wood. Sometimes the steel is exposed, sometimes the wood is exposed. And here you can see the diagram. There's what we call the east building, the middle building, and the west building. The east building and the west building are made of steel trusses, and the west building, which you saw in the early wool and mohair warehouse, is actually a wood construction. And some of what we're doing here is we're replacing, matching the existing Judd details. All of the windows and doors in this building. We're repairing the openings that were kind of relatively quickly repaired by Judd at the time and are now starting to telegraph and cause leaks. And again, the train passes here quite closely, and so the vibrations have caused various problems also related to subsidence and cracking along the seams, and so a lot of that has to be repaired and replaced as well. And then we're also doing a lot of work to make the building more accessible with the addition of some ramps. So this is the middle building. This you can see the what's essentially trusses that were welded from what we think is well pipe or drill pipe, and so those trusses are being repaired and reinforced in particular areas where there might be some weakness from corrosion through the testing. And this is where we've done a lot of analysis with SGH because of some of the lessons we were able to demonstrate in the damage that was incurred at Las Casas, for instance, that the wind on these light structures actually can do a lot of damage over time in West Texas, as we know from our recent focus on Texas energy, that there's a lot of high winds in West Texas that affect a lot of these structures. And so we're doing a lot of work to anchor and reinforce the steel in these middle buildings, and to repair some of the cracking that occurs from those wind events. This is the western building, which is made of wood structure. And so this is actually a little bit easier, but there'll be a little bit more bridging added that mirrors the bridging that exists already in ways that will make this building stronger in the long term. And also you can see a kind of crack back here that's a subsidence issue that we're going to be dealing with in foundation repairs. And so a lot of this work, I just wanted to highlight, or we wanted to highlight in this moment, how a lot of this work gets done. This is an image of Tucker Douglas from our office, and Rosalind. Some of the documentation existed when we started. Much of the documentation that we work from are things that we had to produce on our own, and spending a lot of time at the buildings and at the sites, on ladders and in attics, on rooftops, under buildings. And as Rosalind mentioned in the introduction, depending on how you count, there's more than 20 buildings just in Marfa that we've been investigating in this way. And so that involves everything from different kinds of scans to just very simple measuring, photographic documentation, and the kind of legwork of preservation that goes far beyond what our design side of our practice we would typically do in the kind of as-built production to start a project. So this is a view from the east building where you can see the Judd 2/2 pivot doors, wood pine pivot doors on the interior that Rosalind referred to earlier. And this is Rosalind again working on a sketch outside. This is the portion of the building that faces Oak Street. And you can see that at one point before the Sotal plants were planted, there was a kind of more monumental stair that came down to some kind of front court. There was a wall that was inserted here that breaks up the stair, but we're going to use that wall as a breaking point to actually insert an ADA ramp in this portion to make the space accessible. And the pivoting doors of Donald Judd actually meet the Texas Accessibility Standards codes for clearance and for weight, so we can actually use those pivoting doors for access as well. So here's an image of the courthouse. Sorry, not the courthouse. This is an image of the warehouse wall, and you can see how the plaster has been deteriorating over time. And one of the things we wanted to point out is these are the existing windows, and they turn this black color because they're painted with a mixture of linseed oil and turpentine, which is a very common way to preserve these pine constructions in this part of Texas. And Donald Judd used that extensively on a lot of the wood that's exposed. And you can see a ramp that we've mocked up here to make the spaces of the courtyard more accessible as well. One of the things to point out, and this building I think highlights it, and we can talk in the Q&A if there are questions about some of the more technical aspects of how we define some of the historical periods of significance and how we've examined some of the questions around the relevant periods of restoration. But you know, in simple terms, you can see there's moments like this that for us, Rosalind mentioned Donald Judd's practice was at some level a preservationist practice, and that creates you know, another layer of complexity, I think, when you think about the project of preservation in Marfa with the works of Donald Judd. So, you know, this says wool and mohair. You saw this from the earlier image. There's another sign here. These were another project you might define the period of significance only at the moment where the building was a wool and mohair warehouse. In this case, it's also a significant period, Judd's occupation and Judd's alteration. So this will be painted over, this kind of piece of history, in favor of the Donald Judd period of significance. And so, you know, again, this gets relatively technical, but we can talk, this is the audience for that, so if you have questions. But, you know, this is a building in which, versus the, Rosalind mentioned the process of revealing, and she's going to talk about this some in the other project, where Judd actually intervened quite a lot to construct this image of the building that we have today, and we're maintaining that. The way he would work, and I mentioned this earlier, is there's a large archive of these kinds of sketches. This is a sketch of the pivot doors that Rosalind was describing. In this case, the door is a double opening door, but actually has a movable pivot in one quadrant, and the pivot's drawn. And this style with the pivot in one quadrant is the style of 2/2 door that is in most of the openings in the Chamberlain building. And so we've worked through this, again, through kind of extensive detailing to understand, measuring what's there, what's in the Judd record that we can refer to, but also just to elaborate on the kinds of teams we have to work with. We also have the luxury of working with Peter Stanley, who is an architect by training, but also the director of planning and preservation on the Chanati staff, and also happens to be a great carpenter. And so during the lockdown and COVID on the Chanati wood shop, he's actually been building mock-ups that actually introduce steel elements into the original wood frames, because the wood, the pine wood, which is relatively soft wood, starts to sag over time and create problems with water infiltration that get worse. And so there is a legacy, examples of Donald Judd experimenting with steel in some of the wood installations. And so we've developed a project around that we've been able to actually mock up. And this is the mock-up in the shop. And you can see this is the pivoting light that will now be able to pivot again when it's reinstalled, and you could open it to the outside elements, although that will be a conversation with the conservation staff at Chanati in terms of how much outside air they want to have in the building. And this is it installed as a test. So, you know, this also for us brings up really interesting questions about how, you know, we deliver projects with questions of specification. This now becomes part of what our contractor, who will be on site in April, will start to work from to produce the rest of the windows and doors in the building.
Yeah, and I will add that there is a question of like adding the steel and kind of Donald Judd's intent, and there are a number of existing examples of Judd experimenting with steel inside the wood for windows of this type. So I think for us, what's kind of remarkable at the Chamberlain building are the kind of great lengths that Judd goes to adjust and work on this building, but in a manner that doesn't so much result in something that looks new or different. But there seems to be a kind of expression of something something else going on here. So if we, we said earlier that if we could describe what Donald Judd did at the architecture office as a kind of restoration by revelation or by revealing, maybe we can describe what he did here as at the Chamberlain building as a kind of restoration, not to a historical moment, but to an ideal state. And we're just kind of reaching here to kind of, as kind of architectural thinkers and architectural professors, to kind of think about this a little bit. He's not actually restoring the warehouses in a kind of historic way, but he instead seems to be restoring the warehouses to an idea of a warehouse or to a typology in a rather deliberate way. And he says really explicitly in his UT lecture that it's very silly to constantly refer to the past in architecture, which gives us some clues about how he thought about the past. So notably, this work on the Chamberlain building was completed in 1983. And during this is during his period of collaboration and partnership with Loretto Venturelli, the Italian architect. That was a collaboration that spanned a decade, starting from the late 70s on. And not to draw too many conclusions about the links here to Italian architecture of that time, but these ideas about typology, this use of a kind of selective erasure and a type of preservation work that restores an ideal over restoring the past, they resonate here for us. From the elementally square windows to the stepped facade, there's something that's happening that we think of as a kind of both and approach, both a restoration, but also something new. And so in conclusion, next slide, Troy. We want to go back to the architecture office where our work in Marfa began and where our work has been the most involved, back to the Judd Foundation, and where we have learned so much. It's nearing completion after almost 10 years, and we're preparing for the opening where the building will house new visitors and new life. And in this process, we've come to view our preservation of Donald Judd's work as a way of continuing the work rather than freezing it. So I think we'll just end there. Troy, did you want to add anything?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Troy and Rosalind, for this wonderful lecture, very inspiring. We have time for questions, so I will open the floor for questions from the audience, those of you who are connected on Zoom. I think that you can just raise your hand and perhaps we can find you, or also you can write on the chat your question and we can follow up. So we have as the audience think about their questions, we have a comment from the National Park Service team in DC. I'm just gonna read it to you guys. Says, please tell Rosalind not to have imposter syndrome around preservation rehabilitation terminology. Their work is fantastic. Really enjoyed this presentation. Love looking at Judd's work this way. Very cultural, landscape oriented as an evolution. Thank you. Say thank you.
That's very nice. Thank you.
So there is a question from Robert Melnick, who I believe is all the way on the West Coast, if I'm correct, in Oregon. Very interesting work. Did you consider, that says, yes, did you consider the orientation of the buildings, especially in terms of wind, rain, and sun?
I'll take this question. This is the way this has come up most often is that, and this is where the two periods of significance, which are the periods in which when you're restoring a building that you're trying to define in order to have a kind of a reference for where the history should be reflected in the final project. These older buildings, for instance, like the slide we're looking at now, originally had canopies, often in West Texas, and they also had other kinds of features that would sometimes deal with operable windows or even fabric shades that would actually it makes perfect sense in terms of like shading the streetscape, allowing people to see in storefront windows, but have the storefront windows shaded, but clear story windows above that would let light in, for instance, if you look at the doorway in the building you see now. And so, there would be a period of significance in which that particular shading device would be historically accurate. Some of the buildings, when you're looking at this legacy of Donald Judd, actually didn't, for whatever reason, have canopies installed in some of the time periods we're looking at, because somebody had taken them off in the 1950s or because somebody had altered them. And so I think when a lot of the complexity that's coming up in our work around this question is as you're defining what's called period of significance, and there's the question of thinking of what makes the most sense in terms of orientation, but you're also as our advisors and collaborators, the Park Service would know, there's the tension between that and the kind of expression of the building with in its historic character that reflect the moment. And so we've spent a lot of time working with the Texas Historical Commission that reviews some of this work, and ultimately with the National Park Service, and thinking about some of those tensions that come up. So that's one of the reasons in this case, this window that you're looking at faces west. It doesn't have a canopy on it right now, but we're reinstalling a canopy to protect the works and to also make the building function in the way that it was designed to function originally as well. And there's been a lot of study around sun angles and depths of canopies and how that affects the image of the building. So that would come up the most. And we find that features in a lot of the projects.
Okay, thank you. Michael, please go ahead.
Hi, you all mentioned entropy, which is the right intro to my question. I'm wondering if your scope includes, and if you have yet looked at, the adobe landscape walls that are throughout town and which Judd apparently elected to build without the plastering that makes them a renewable and sustainable system.
Go ahead, Troy.
You're
laughing.
No, our scope does not include the landscape walls. That's the simple answer. But we have, as in our various relationships out there, followed a lot of the study that's been done, some of which by some of the same people that we do work with directly, like Simpson, Gumpertz, and Haggart, on those walls. And it's a very interesting case for those that don't know. The block that we showed earlier was surrounded by these adobe walls. The Chamberlain building was surrounded by adobe walls, or at least partially surrounded. And those walls have a kind of cement in the mortar that doesn't erode as quickly as the adobe does. And it creates a character of the wall that's become almost Marfa defining in terms of its image, some would argue. Whether or not you think about the correctness of the propriety functionally, it has a certain image. And so there has been a lot of work that has gone into with other parties than us that have studied how to repair those walls in place, whether it's rebuild the walls, how to stabilize the walls. It's a significant project that needs to be undertaken in stages and needs to be funded if anybody wants to fund it. But it's a big project, but it's become character defining for really the whole community. And so there's been a lot of investment and thought in how to do that. But I think there's been some success in figuring out ways to actually repair them and maintain them over time. and so I'm optimistic that they're going to be able to do that. But I know the debate around that question, and that some is interesting, and it's interesting for us because it comes up in a lot of the other, those kinds of questions come up in a lot of the other projects that we look at, where there's a feature that might have been an unintended consequence of a decision that Donald Judd made, but is now become a character defining feature of a particular project. And so you have to then reflect on, you know, the functionality of that character defining feature, the intentionality of that character defining feature, and then ultimately, you know, work with all the people that have voices in that. So the walls are part of that. It's a really interesting story, and there's been a lot of paper and ink spilled on what to do with them.
Thank you. Michelle, please go ahead.
So you were talking a moment ago about references and where you go and where you look for references. And you know, this takes me to a particular frame of references on two different levels, and it's the Harvard Five in New Canaan. You know, thinking about sort of their approach to appropriating land, their approach to occupying it, and you know, sort of that the idea of that cluster, you know, the cluster of individuals and the cluster of their buildings that ended up being both meant to be examples, models, tests, experiments, as well as their place of residence, and whether or not sort of there's a set of influences that come from New Canaan. But I'm also thinking, I guess the only reason I thought about this is as soon as you showed in his own compound the art gallery, I couldn't help but think about the brick house at Philip Johnson's Glass House, which is the picture gallery. Also, that totally insular, completely disconnected from its environment building. For me, the parallels were fairly strong on that. Whether or not you're seeing, so I think the behind this question is sort of understanding at what level do you engage different kinds of references or precedents in sort of understanding the lineage of the work and what you're choosing to respond to in it.
I would say, you know, one of the things that we have to acknowledge in terms of collaboration in this, and it's pretty obvious to anyone that knows the situation, is that we work quite a lot in a very collaborative team with Rainer Judd and Flavin Judd, who are Donald Judd's children, who are very involved in the restoration of 101 Spring Street, for instance. And this is maybe not quite the same kind of team of experts that you're referring to, but they're one of the conduits, also along with folks like Caitlin Murray, who's who works in the archive, to try to understand, and we have access to this huge archive, and as do Rainer and Flavin, to understand the references that what Judd was reading at the time, you know, what other kinds of work Judd was doing, who Judd was collaborating with at the time. And so a lot of the referential conversation, I think, comes to us through that avenue. Zooming out, I think that's like really guiding a lot of the work on references. Rosalind and I internally speculate a lot in the way you are, Michelle, about the kind of maybe the extra archival references that you could use to like situate this kind of work as well, and look at some of the influences of yeah, as Rosalind mentioned, like typological thinking from Italy, and knowing some of the kind of things that Judd was exposed to that are maybe more salient for architects than for others. Yeah, I don't know if that's getting at your answer. What do you think, Rosalind?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess I like what you said, Troy, about the internal speculation, because I think we're really part of being open to what's in the archive and learning in this kind of collaborative process is kind of holding back sometimes this like desire to kind of connect things that feel possible but maybe don't always need to be aired. And so we're trying to kind of center Judd and center the archive and center the kind of memories and what we know as this kind of living process without projecting too much on it. And I think that's also this kind of, I feel like Judd speaks directly to us in that talk about not paying too much attention to history. I feel like there might be a thing about not paying too much attention to the references that you bring with you, you know? And so I think, yes, I want to do those things, and I do those things inside. And sometimes Troy and I do those things privately between us. And that's also, I think, one of the reasons why some of the speculation that we did in this talk, we do kind of gently, you know?
Yeah.
We don't want to tread too heavily. Yeah.
We obviously, didn't know Donald Judd, but having looked at his archive and his work so much, I think he would be appalled to be compared to Philip Johnson.
I know. That's the bizarre part about it.
It's certainly an escape from much of what that kind of insular New York culture represented. But it's interesting to speculate about these other kinds of kind of complete universe type practices that you're describing. Imagine a certain kind of completeness and how they found their way into the world in that time.
A fantastic answer. I love the way that you framed this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, there doesn't seem to be more questions. I want to ask you a question. We have in the audience students that are working on the historic preservation field, who have an experience or an exposure to historic preservation. But also we have students who are pretty much looking at the practice of architecture as the exercise of creating new buildings, right? Of creating new structures. I think it has permeated throughout your presentation, your attitude, your philosophy towards design in the context of preservation. But if you will have to, somehow do a summary of what your collaboration, your firm, you as designers, what the role of a designer will be in the context of preservation in general, how will you respond to that?
I'll try to do it, Rosalind.
You get started.
This is awkward on all of it on each other. But one thing we always say about our practice, and I think it's true, is I think whether we're proposing a new project from the ground up or whether we're working on preservation, I think a lot of the production and practice of an architect is to draw through agreement, meaning to draw until there's a kind of agreement about how to mobilize all the different individual voices and resources that a project engages in. And a lot of this practice that we've been trying to reflect on, while formally and some of the tactics are very different than what we engage in some of the other projects that some people in the audience might look at on our website, that fundamental human process of engaging in reflection, drawing, and ultimately the articulation and construction of agreement about the future is something that I think that we're engaged in, which is I think how Rosalind so well summed up our talk.
I would add also the thing that Troy and I talked about when we were putting the talk together was to mention the ways in which this has been a process for us that has, I think, influenced us a lot, that it has taught us in our other work. And we mentioned this in the talk, some restraint, right? And like to understand, to slow down and to decide when it's better to do nothing. Mm-hmm. Maybe not nothing at all, but there's lots of instances where you can do less. And then that also is a kind of recalibration of how you see a project, right? If you do make this kind of pause. I think that like the process of working in collaboration with the Judd Foundation has been, I guess I would describe it as, yeah, a recalibration of like being able to kind of sense what it is that we are doing. And sometimes we would have these, and I always tell these stories about like how we would have these long conversations about what fixture to install, and at the end of a very long process to decide that we would use the most ordinary fixture that is available at the hardware store down the street or something like that. And like to be able to come to such a humble conclusion after a large amount of deliberation is doing a kind of work on yourself as a designer. I think, you know, because there's I mean, this tendency to want to like control everything and do everything in a way that's always like visible, right? I don't know. I think it just like we bring us into a kind of presence of the work that is a bit more stealth or just like present, maybe an appreciation for that. So I think that does influence our work, and it kind of maybe also just like in terms of economy and like restraint and not moving into a space where everything has to be so expensive all the time. You know, I mean, this is not, I don't know. I think that there's a kind of ethos at a kind of ethical level. It starts to kind of form us a bit. Maybe that's kind of an abstract answer.
I think it's very practical. I think it's very practical. Yeah. It's this notion of the role of the designer is interpreting the role of the design, the previous designer, and not precisely have a prominent role in the actions, right? It's more about reading it. It's a kind of a mixture between some type of archaeology, history type of research that merges with the design skills and understanding in order to provide an answer that is subtle and refined. So
and part of the conversation that is already happening, but you first have to hear it, I think.
Yeah.
You know.
And inhabiting perspectives outside of your own, I think, is a big part of it as well, which is, you know, something you try to do in all of your practice, but in this preservation work becomes especially present.
Well, I don't see any other hands up, but so I think we are going to wrap it up for today. Thank you very much. This was an amazing lecture, I have to say. I mean, it really presents, that's why I was talking about the role of the designer, you know, all the different aspects that are involved into a project of this nature, of any nature that has to deal with the historic structure, all the way from the larger picture design, as I mentioned, history, archaeology, etc., to the refinement of creating details, those drawings that, you know, study the different possibilities for the windows and the solutions and the insertion of metal, etc. That level of complexity, it kind of embraces all the different scales that pretty much present what practice of this nature is, and of course your talents and your abilities and your refinement as designers that come through the work that you guys do. Thank you very much. This was very, very inspiring, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. We're really grateful for being here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having us, and hopefully we can meet in person at some point.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, that'll be good. Sometime soon.
Thank you all.
All right.
So we are getting a bunch of comments on the chat, and let's receive them. Megan, whenever you one, I think we can conclude the session. Thank you again. Thank you, Rosalind.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye,
Nice to meet you.
Michelle.